Trash like you belongs in a goddamn dumpster, not a federal courthouse. Those were the words that would echo in Officer Frank Miller's skull for the rest of his miserable life. A venomous ghost of his own making. Have you ever wondered what happens when a so-called pillar of the community, a man sworn to protect and serve, is nothing more than a monster hiding in plain sight? What happens when that monster finally picks the wrong fight? Well, buckle up, because you are about to witness a story of instant karma so savage, so complete, you'll be talking about it for years. And before we dive in, do me a favor and smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this are exactly why you're here, and you are not going to want to miss a single second of what comes next. It was a brutally cold Tuesday morning in November in the city of Port Sterling. The wind howled off the lake, sharp as a razor, whipping around the granite columns of the Donnelly Federal Courthouse. Judge Evelyn Hayes, 58 years old, and a 23-year veteran of the federal bench, approached the courthouse steps just as she had nearly every weekday for over 2 decades. She was in her civilian clothes, a simple but elegant wool coat, dark slacks, and a leather briefcase that held the day's case files. She wasn't Judge Hayes at that moment. She was just Evelyn, a woman heading to work. That was her first mistake. Another piece of ghetto trash trying to sneak in. The voice was a low growl, thick with contempt. Officer Frank Miller blocked her path. He was a big man, his uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest and a burgeoning gut, his face a fleshy mask of smug superiority. He sneered down at her, his eyes raking over her with an appraisal that was both dismissive and predatory. Before Evelyn could even process the insult, his open palm cracked against her face. The sound was like a gunshot in the frigid morning air. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side, and a starburst of pain exploded behind her eye. Her expensive briefcase flew from her grasp, its contents, judicial memoranda, sensitive case files, confidential legal documents, scattering across the courthouse steps like a tragic parody of confetti. The shock had barely registered when Miller grabbed her by the throat, his sausage-like fingers digging into her flesh, cutting off her air. He slammed her backward against one of the cold, unyielding stone walls. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a terrifying second, the world went gray at the edges. "Trash like you belongs in a goddamn dumpster, not a federal courthouse," he spat, his foul breath washing over her face. He twisted her arms viciously behind her back, the metallic bite of handcuffs cold and sharp against her wrists. The cuffs were ratcheted so tight they felt like they were grinding against bone. Other officers, Russo and Davis, ambled over, not to intervene, but to enjoy the show. Laughter echoed off the stone. One of them pulled out his phone and started recording, a sick grin plastered on his face. Evelyn's jaw throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache, but her eyes, blazing with a cold, controlled fury, remained locked on the massive bronze nameplate mounted above the courthouse entrance. The Honorable Evelyn M. Hayes, presiding. She was less than 50 feet from her own courtroom, being brutalized and humiliated by the very system she had dedicated her life to upholding. Have you ever seen a man dig his own grave with such enthusiasm? Drop a comment below if you think you know what's coming, but I promise you, the reality is 1,000 times more satisfying than you can imagine. Inside the courthouse, Miller straightened his uniform, a preening gesture of self-satisfaction. He cleared his throat, preparing for the performance. He'd done this dance 100 times before. Spin the story, control the narrative, paint himself as the hero, the thin blue line holding back the tide of urban decay. The system, in his experience, always believed the word of a cop over the word of a criminal, especially when the criminal looked like Evelyn Hayes. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone, addressing the temporary judge, a pale, wispy man in his 60s named Albright, who was covering the morning's arraignments. "I was conducting routine security protocols at the main entrance when I encountered a suspicious individual attempting to breach courthouse security." He gestured theatrically toward Evelyn, who was now seated at the defendant's table. The handcuffs were still on, and a grotesque purple bruise was already blooming across her left cheek, a testament to his professionalism. The defendant was acting erratically, refusing to provide any form of identification, and became increasingly agitated and hostile when asked to comply with standard security procedures. Miller lied with the ease of long practice. Judge Albright, a man who seemed to have been born to nod approvingly at men in uniform, leaned forward. "And what exactly did you observe that was suspicious, Officer Miller?" "Well, sir, she was dressed inappropriately for court proceedings, carrying what appeared to be stolen legal documents." Miller's eyes gleamed with the thrill of his own fabrication. He was warming up now, the lies flowing like water. "When I approached to investigate, she became verbally aggressive, using profanity and making direct threats against my person." From the gallery, his partners, Russo and Davis, exchanged knowing smirks. They'd heard this script before, a well-rehearsed piece of fiction that had successfully stripped countless people of their rights and dignity. Different faces, same story. "She kept screaming about being someone important," Miller continued, his voice dripping with a carefully calibrated disdain. "These people always do. They claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. I've seen this exact playbook before, Your Honor." Judge Albright was completely hooked. "And did she attempt to flee or resist arrest?" "Absolutely, Your Honor. The defendant became physically combative when I attempted to place her in protective custody for her own safety and the safety of the public. I was forced," he said, pausing for dramatic effect, "to use the minimum necessary force to ensure public safety." Miller's hand gave a nearly imperceptible tremble as he spoke, the only crack in his polished facade. The court stenographer's fingers flew across her machine, dutifully transcribing every perjured word for posterity. In the back row, a young law clerk frowned, a nagging sense of familiarity tickling the edge of her memory. The prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman named Sandra Jennings, called the next witness. "Officer Russo, can you corroborate Officer Miller's testimony?" Russo stood, his uniform pressed to starched perfection. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent our security protocols. Officer Miller handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint." "And the alleged assault?" Judge Albright inquired. Miller's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, as I stated, I used only the force necessary to subdue an aggressive and non-compliant individual who posed a threat to courthouse security. The defendant's injuries, if any, are a direct result of her own violent resistance to lawful commands." He pulled out his personal phone, swiping to a video that conveniently began mid-confrontation after he had already struck her. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor. Unfortunately, my department-issued body cam malfunctioned this morning." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. "How convenient," Evelyn murmured, speaking for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. "I'm sorry?" Judge Albright raised an eyebrow, annoyed by the interruption. "Nothing, Your Honor," she replied calmly, her eyes blazing with a fire she was keeping tightly leashed. Miller, feeling his momentum, pressed on. "What we are seeing here is a classic case of someone playing the victim card after being caught breaking the law. She was trespassing on government property, carrying suspicious documents that were clearly stolen, and when confronted with her criminal behavior, she immediately defaulted to claiming discrimination." Prosecutor Jennings nodded sympathetically, seeing a quick and easy conviction. "Officer Miller, in your 15 years of service, have you encountered similar situations?" "Unfortunately, yes, ma'am. There's a pattern. Certain individuals believe they're above the law, that the rules don't apply to them. They use baseless accusations of racism as a shield to deflect from their own criminal behavior. Miller's voice rose with righteous indignation. Frankly, it's insulting to the real victims of discrimination. Several courthouse employees in the gallery, mostly white, nodded in solemn agreement. The narrative was familiar, comfortable. It fit what they saw on the news every night. "The defendant claims she was going to work," Miller said, making mocking air quotes. "But she couldn't provide any employment verification, any identification, or any legitimate reason for being in a restricted area of the courthouse." Davis, the third officer, stepped forward to add his own layer to the lie. "If I may add, Your Honor, the defendant was carrying what appeared to be confidential and sealed legal documents. We have reason to suspect she may have been involved in some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme." Judge Albright looked intrigued. "A fraud scheme?" "Yes, sir." Miller jumped back in, sensing the kill. "These documents had judicial letterheads, active case numbers, and highly sensitive information. No legitimate citizen would have access to materials like this. We believe she may have been planning to impersonate court personnel to gain access to sensitive areas." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating, but Miller, blinded by his own arrogance, pressed on, completely oblivious to the fact that he was meticulously building his own gallows. "In my professional opinion," he concluded, turning to face Evelyn directly, his eyes cold and contemptuous, "this is simply another case of someone trying to game the system. She knows if she can make this about race, about alleged police brutality, she can distract from her actual crimes. It's a calculated manipulation of public sympathy. These people think they can just waltz into any building, any courtroom, any space they choose. And when they're stopped, they scream discrimination. Well, not on my watch. Not in my courthouse." The words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Jennings added smoothly, "the state recommends we proceed with charges of trespassing, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. The defendant's transparent attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is clearly a desperate, last-ditch defense strategy." Miller allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This was going exactly as planned. Another case, another win, another day of teaching people their place. He felt emboldened, adding one last embellishment. "Furthermore, I want to emphasize that I showed remarkable restraint. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of narcotics. A lesser officer might have been forced to use much more significant, even lethal force." "Your professionalism is noted, Officer Miller," Judge Albright said gravely. In the defendant's chair, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap despite the biting steel of the handcuffs. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, but anyone looking closely would have seen the slight, chilling upturn at the corners of her mouth. She was taking mental notes, recording every lie, every fabrication, every single detail that would soon unravel not just Miller's career, but his entire life. The officer had absolutely no idea he was delivering his own eulogy in front of the one person who had the power to sign his death warrant. "Is there anything else you'd like to add, officer?" Judge Albright asked, ready to wrap things up. Miller straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest. "Just that incidents like this are a stark reminder of why we need strong law enforcement. Some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned a valuable lesson today. Actions have consequences." He had no idea how prophetic those words would be. As Miller stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Evelyn's eye one final time. He winked at her, a gesture of absolute dominance, of total crushing victory. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire life. "The defendant may now present her statement," Judge Albright announced, his tone making it clear this was a mere formality before sentencing. Evelyn Hayes rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly in the silent courtroom. Despite the angry purple bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity, an aura of authority that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was clear, controlled, and filled the room with a resonance that seemed to startle Judge Albright. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." Albright blinked. Something in her tone, calm, professional, precise, didn't match the hysterical, erratic woman Miller had described. "First," she began, her eyes sweeping the courtroom methodically, landing for a moment on each person who had supported Miller's lies, "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Miller's testimony. According to his sworn statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk, approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Albright directly, her tone now subtly instructive, as if speaking to a law student. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in Hague v. Werther, Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums, where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. Prosecutor Jennings frowned, a flicker of unease crossing her face. This was not the rambling, emotional outburst they expected from a cornered suspect. "Furthermore," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength, "Officer Miller testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." She gestured with her cuffed hands toward the evidence table, where her scattered papers had been collected. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files for United States v. Moretti, judicial memoranda regarding sentencing guidelines, and administrative correspondence related to the Fourth Circuit Judicial Conference, all of which I have legitimate, and I might add exclusive access to in my professional capacity." "Professional capacity?" Judge Albright interrupted, a hint of irritation in his voice. "And what exactly is your profession, Miss—" Evelyn paused, a slight, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "It's Judge, actually. Dr. Hayes, and I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." A cold dread began to seep into Frank Miller's bones. This was wrong. This was all going very, very wrong. "Your Honor, if I may continue," Evelyn said, her voice taking on the unmistakable cadence of someone who was not just comfortable, but completely in command in a courtroom. "Officer Miller also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity. I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination regarding any statements I may have made during the commission of a felony assault against my person." She paused, letting that sink in. "However, I will note for the record that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, without warning, and without any legal justification whatsoever." The young law clerk in the back row sat bolt upright. That voice, that command of legal phrasing. She knew that voice. "Now, regarding the officer's convenient claim that his body cam malfunctioned," Evelyn continued, and now there was steel in her voice, "Your Honor, I'm sure you are aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 1006, which allows for the admission of summaries of voluminous recordings. I have reason to believe that comprehensive, high-definition video and audio evidence of this morning's entire incident exists and will be made available to this court shortly." Judge Albright leaned forward, his bewilderment turning to alarm. "What kind of evidence are you referring to?" "Your Honor, this courthouse has an extensive security camera network, including 4 high-definition cameras positioned at 15-foot intervals along the main plaza, all of which record directly to a secure off-site server. Additionally," she said, turning her head slightly to look directly at Miller. The Port Sterling Police Department maintains an automatic, encrypted, cloud-based backup system for all officer body cam footage, regardless of any claimed equipment malfunctions on the device itself. The data uploads in 60-second intervals. The color drained from Frank Miller's face. He had completely forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his rush to build his self-serving narrative. "I would like to formally request," Evelyn continued, her voice ringing with authority, "that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from the courthouse plaza and its environs from this morning, between the hours of 8:45 a.m. and 9:05 a.m. This request includes, but is not limited to, all courthouse security footage, all PSPD body cam cloud backup files, and any and all mobile phone recordings that may have been made by Officers Russo and Davis, who were present at the scene." Prosecutor Jennings leaped to her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make wild evidentiary demands without proper legal representation." Evelyn turned to face the prosecutor with a look so cold and commanding that Ms. Jennings took an involuntary step backward. "Your Honor, pro se defendants have a constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment. Furthermore, the precedent set in Brady v. Maryland establishes the prosecution's absolute obligation to preserve and turn over any and all potentially exculpatory evidence. Are you suggesting this court ignore both the Sixth Amendment and a landmark Supreme Court ruling, Ms. Jennings?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. This was not how these cases were supposed to go. Judge Albright cleared his throat, his face now beaded with sweat. "Miss Hayes, you seem unusually familiar with legal procedure. Do you have formal legal training?" "I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor," Evelyn replied, her voice carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked terrifyingly like amusement. She walked, as much as the handcuffs would allow, toward the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings. "Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Miller's characterization of my presence here as suspicious or unauthorized." She pointed to a specific document among the papers, a leather-bound judicial planner. "This is my daily court calendar, which shows I was scheduled to preside over, that I was scheduled to appear in this very building for legitimate business, starting promptly at 9 a.m. this morning." The bailiff, a large, stoic man named Henderson, who had worked in this courthouse for 15 years, suddenly went very still. His eyes widened as he stared at Evelyn, a wave of dawning horror washing over his face. "Officer Miller testified that I claimed to be someone important," Evelyn continued, her voice steady and clear. "I'd like to clarify for the record that I never made any such claim during our encounter. However, I did attempt to show him my identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his assault." She paused, surveying the now terrified faces in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I have in my possession, despite Officer Miller's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my identity and my legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning." Judge Albright was beginning to look physically ill. What kind of documentation?" Evelyn reached carefully into the inner pocket of her coat, moving slowly and deliberately. She produced her judicial parking pass, issued by the courthouse's administrative office. Then her building access card, programmed with the entry code to her own judicial chambers. And finally, her official identification. Bailiff Henderson shot to his feet, his face as pale as a ghost. He recognized the woman he had greeted with a respectful, "Good morning, Your Honor," nearly every day for the past 15 years. "Your Honor," Evelyn said quietly, holding up a leather credential wallet. Even from across the room, the embossed gold judicial seal was unmistakable. "I believe there has been a significant and perhaps career-ending misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Miller assaulted this morning. She let her words hang in the air. Perhaps we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified? Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who was used to giving orders in courtrooms, not taking them. Judge Albright stared at the credential wallet, then at Evelyn's bruised but defiant face, then at the bailiff, who was nodding grimly, his expression one of pure terror. Court will recess for 15 minutes, he croaked, his voice hoarse. As the gavel fell, Frank Miller felt the floor drop out from under him. His entire world was beginning to crumble, and he was starting to realize, with a dawning, sickening horror, that he hadn't just broken the rules of the game. He had assaulted the person who owned the entire goddamn stadium. During the 15-minute recess, the Donnelly Federal Courthouse buzzed with the frantic, nervous energy of a kicked beehive. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Evelyn sat calmly while Bailiff Henderson fumbled with a set of keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit one into the lock on her handcuffs. "Judge Hayes," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of horror and awe. "Jesus Christ, Judge Hayes, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in your civilian clothes, and when they brought you in like that, It's all right, Henderson," Evelyn replied, her voice soft but firm as she rubbed her bruised wrists. "You were not a part of this, but I need you to do something for me now." "Anything, Your Honor. Anything at all." "I need you to go to my chambers, go quietly, and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim." She paused, looking him directly in the eye. "And Henderson, bring my gavel too, the engraved one from my swearing-in ceremony." Henderson nodded vigorously and practically sprinted out of the room, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts. She closed her eyes and took a long, centering breath, the way she had trained herself to do before delivering a major ruling. This morning, she had walked towards the courthouse as Judge Evelyn Hayes, a respected jurist, a protector of constitutional rights, a guardian of justice. In the span of a few minutes, Officer Miller had transformed her into a victim, a defendant, a ghetto rat, in handcuffs facing a litany of trumped-up charges. But now, it was time to reclaim what was hers. Her phone, which had been confiscated during the arrest but was now hastily returned, buzzed incessantly with missed calls and urgent messages. Her clerk, Janet, had sent a series of increasingly frantic texts. "Judge Hayes, where are you? The Peterson hearing is in 30 minutes. Your Honor, the attorneys are all here asking about the delay. Should I tell them something? Judge Hayes, please call me back. There are rumors spreading that something happened outside." Evelyn typed back a quick, concise reply. "Janet, tell the Peterson attorneys we'll reschedule. Something more important has come up. And clear my entire afternoon calendar." She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she was looking for. Chief Judge Annabelle Rodriguez, the administrative head of the entire judicial district, and an old friend from law school. "Annabelle, it's Evelyn." "Evelyn, thank God. We heard there was some kind of incident. Are you all right?" "I've been better, Annie. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it immediately without asking any questions right now." "Of course, whatever you need. I need you to contact the Courthouse Security Office and the U.S. Marshals Service. Tell them to immediately preserve and make multiple redundant copies of all surveillance footage from the courthouse plaza and its surrounding areas from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m. All cameras, all angles. And Annabelle," she added, her voice hardening, "make sure those copies are stored in different, secure locations." There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. "Evelyn, what in God's name happened this morning?" A police officer named Frank Miller just spent the better part of an hour testifying under oath about how he heroically subdued a dangerous, erratic criminal who was trespassing on federal property. Evelyn's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it that Chief Judge Rodriguez had never heard before. The dangerous criminal was me, Annabelle, on my way to work. He didn't just arrest me. He assaulted me in front of my own courthouse, called me trash, and told me I belonged in a cage. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Jesus Christ, Evelyn. What do you need? Should I call the FBI? The Attorney General's office? Not yet. Right now, I need those recordings secured, and I need you to make some phone calls. I want every single case Officer Frank Miller has testified in over the past 5 years pulled and flagged for immediate review. Every single one. Consider it done. But Evelyn, you can't handle this case yourself. It's a massive conflict of interest. Oh, I'm not going to handle it, Annie. I'm going to preside over his damnation. Her voice was now as cold as the November wind. In about 5 minutes, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom, and I'm going to be wearing my judicial robes. Officer Miller is going to learn exactly who he assaulted this morning, and more importantly, he's going to learn who has the power to ensure he faces the full and terrible consequences of his actions. Henderson returned, carrying a garment bag and a small, polished wooden box. Your robes, Your Honor, and your gavel. Evelyn stood and unzipped the garment bag, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on, she felt the transformation begin. The heavy fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of authority. Each fold and crease was a reminder of the immense power she wielded, the sacred oaths she had taken, and the justice she was sworn to protect. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel. Its weight was familiar and comforting in her hand. Engraved on its handle were the words she lived by. Justitia non novit patrem nec matrem, solam veritatem spectat. Justice knows neither father nor mother. It beholds the truth alone. Henderson, she said, adjusting her robes, when we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me, properly. Yes, Your Honor. How would you like me to announce you? Evelyn Hayes straightened to her full height, every inch the formidable federal judge she had been for 23 years. The Honorable Judge Evelyn M. Hayes, presiding. She glanced at herself in the small mirror on the holding room wall. The ugly bruise on her cheek was still starkly visible against her dark skin. But now it served a different purpose. It was no longer just a mark of Miller's brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen and how completely, how utterly, it was about to be restored. When court resumes, she said to her reflection, Officer Miller is going to learn what justice really means. All rise! Bailiff Henderson's voice boomed through the courtroom with a thunderous authority that made every person in the room snap to attention. But what happened next was a moment that would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. This court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn M. Hayes presiding! The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. Officer Miller, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, whispering with Jennings, went rigid, his face instantly draining of all color. Judge Albright, who had just retaken his seat, turned a shade of pale that bordered on translucent. Prosecutor Jennings's mouth fell open in a silent gasp of horror. Judge Evelyn Hayes entered through the judge's private chamber door. She was wearing her full judicial robes, the gold trim catching the overhead lights. She moved with the slow, measured, deliberate pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before. In her right hand, she carried her ceremonial gavel. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound you could hear the frantic pounding of hearts. Not a single person dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, her movements filled with a terrifying grace. Her eyes, cold and hard as diamonds, swept the courtroom, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every single person who was finally, sickeningly, beginning to understand the true magnitude of what had just transpired. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice quiet but carrying the full, amplified weight of judicial authority. "You may remain standing." Miller looked like he was about to vomit. His face had cycled from red to white to a sickly green in the span of 30 seconds. Your Honor," Judge Albright stammered, scrambling to his feet. I mean to say—" "Judge Albright," Evelyn interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket now. I will handle this matter from here." Albright practically fled the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him as if he were being chased by the hounds of hell. Evelyn turned her full, undivided attention back to Miller, who was now visibly shaking, his legs looking like they might give out at any moment. "Officer Miller, approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Miller couldn't form a coherent word. "Let me refresh your memory for you," Evelyn continued, her voice dangerously calm. "You stated, and I am quoting the court record, these people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. Do you remember saying that?" Miller managed a weak, pathetic nod. "You also stated that I was, quote, just another entitled activist looking for a payday, and that you had seen, quote, this playbook before. Is that an accurate recollection of your testimony?" The courtroom was so quiet that the low hum of the HVAC system sounded like a jet engine. "And perhaps most memorably," Evelyn's voice grew colder, dropping several degrees, "you stated that people like me need to learn that, quote, actions have consequences. Do you recall dispensing that particular piece of wisdom, officer?" Miller's legs were shaking so hard he had to grip the edge of the defendant's table to remain upright. Evelyn reached under her bench and produced a tablet computer, its screen glowing. "Officer Miller, I would like to show you, and the rest of this court, some evidence that has just come to my attention." She turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom. On it was crystal clear, multi-angle security camera footage from the courthouse steps, showing the entire incident from the beginning. "This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which has an unobstructed, high-definition view of the main entrance," she explained, her finger touching the screen to start the video. The entire courtroom watched in shared horror as the events unfolded. There was Evelyn, walking calmly toward the courthouse. There was Miller, blocking her path. And then, his voice, clear as a bell, filled the courtroom from the tablet's speakers. "Another piece of ghetto trash trying to sneak in?" Several people gasped audibly. The video continued, showing Miller's unprovoked, brutal assault in vivid, sickening detail. The sharp crack of the slap that snapped Evelyn's head sideways. The brutal grab at her throat. The contemptuous way he slammed her against the wall. But the most damning moment, the one that sealed his fate forever, was yet to come. "Trash like you belongs in a goddamn dumpster, not a federal courthouse." Miller's own words, spoken with such pure, undiluted venom and hatred, echoed through the courtroom that was supposed to be a temple of justice. Several jurors from other cases who had been waiting in the gallery stood up and walked out in silent, unified disgust. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, pausing the video, her voice deceptively soft. "Do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats?" Miller remained silent, his career, his life, his entire world disintegrating before his very eyes. "Now," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening again, "let's examine your sworn testimony that your body cam malfunctioned." She swiped to a new video file. This is backup footage retrieved directly from your own body cam, automatically uploaded to the county's encrypted cloud storage system every 60 seconds, a system you apparently forgot existed. The new video began to play, and Miller's voice once again filled the courtroom. But this time it was even worse. This was the unedited director's cut. "Look at this uppity bitch thinking she can just walk into my courthouse." Miller's voice snarled through the speakers, a recording of his thoughts just before the assault. "These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another one a lesson." The prosecutor, Sandra Jennings, was frantically and clumsily gathering her papers, trying to physically distance herself from the nuclear catastrophe unfolding before her. But Evelyn wasn't finished with her, or with Miller's accomplices. "Officer Russo, Officer Davis," she called out, her voice ringing like a judgment bell. "You both testified under oath, not 30 minutes ago, that Officer Miller handled this situation with remarkable professionalism. Would either of you like to revise your statements at this time?" Both officers, who were sitting in the gallery, were already ghost white and edging toward the exit like frightened rats. "And here," Evelyn said, advancing the video to show the assault from Miller's own first-person perspective. "We can see the exact moment when Officer Frank Miller committed felony assault against a federal judge." She let those words hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. "Federal judge." Miller's knees finally buckled. He grabbed onto the prosecutor's table, his knuckles white, to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. "But wait," Evelyn said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than her anger. "There's more." She pulled up a new file on her tablet. "This is audio retrieved from Officer Davis's body cam, which was apparently functioning perfectly this morning." A new voice filled the courtroom. Davis's voice, speaking to Russo while Miller was assaulting Evelyn. "Dude, Frankie's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps trying to say?" Russo's voice responded, thick with casual bigotry. "Nah, man. Look at her. Miller knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare queen trying to scam the system." Their shared laughter, recorded as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge, was the sound of 3 careers ending simultaneously. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Miller with raw, undisguised revulsion. "Officer Miller," Evelyn said, setting down her tablet with a soft click. "You expressed concern earlier that I had no employment verification. Well, as it turns out, I do." She gestured to the Great Seal of the United States mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her bronze nameplate, then to the official oil-painted portrait of her that hung in the courthouse lobby. "I have been the presiding judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Miller. Every case you have ever testified in, every warrant you have ever requested, every search you have ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my authority." Miller finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled, pathetic whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." "You didn't know?" Evelyn repeated slowly, letting the pathetic excuse hang in the air before dissecting it with surgical precision. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look. You saw a black woman, and you made assumptions. You saw someone you thought was powerless, and you decided to abuse your power for your own sick amusement." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "But Officer Miller, there's something else you didn't know." The courtroom held its breath. "For the past 6 months, I have been personally overseeing a joint investigation with the FBI's Civil Rights Division into a pattern of misconduct, corruption, and racial bias within the Port Sterling Police Department." Miller's face went from white to the color of ash. "This morning's incident wasn't random, Officer Miller. You have been a primary subject of that investigation, and you just provided us with the most perfect, irrefutable, beautifully recorded evidence we could have ever hoped for. She lifted her gavel and held it in front of her. "Officer Miller, you said actions have consequences. You were right about that." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "Court will recess while I consider the appropriate and numerous charges to be filed against you and your co-conspirators." As Miller collapsed into a chair, a broken man, he finally understood. He hadn't just assaulted a random woman. He had assaulted justice itself, and justice was about to hit back with the force of a hurricane. When court resumed 20 minutes later, the atmosphere had transformed completely. Word had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Lawyers, clerks, bailiffs, and court reporters had quietly filed into the gallery, drawn by the electrifying whispers of the most spectacular courtroom reversal in the building's history. The room was packed, silent, and vibrating with anticipation. Miller sat slumped in what was now, unequivocally, the defendant's chair. His uniform was wrinkled, his face ashen. A nervous public defender named Michael Carter, who had been hastily summoned, sat beside him, shooting worried glances at his catatonic client. Judge Evelyn Hayes returned to her bench with the same measured dignity she had displayed thousands of times before. But now, every eye in the room saw her differently. This wasn't just any judge. This was the woman who had been brutalized by the man now trembling before her. A woman who had single-handedly turned the tables on a corrupt system. "Officer Miller," she began, her voice carrying the full, unassailable weight of her 23 years of judicial authority. "Before we proceed with the very serious criminal charges you are now facing, I believe this court, and everyone present, deserves to understand exactly who you assaulted this morning." She stood, moving from behind the bench to address the packed courtroom directly, her robes flowing around her. "My name is Judge Evelyn M. Hayes. I have served as the presiding judge of this federal courthouse for 23 years. I was appointed to this position by President Clinton in 2001, and I was confirmed by the United States Senate with a unanimous bipartisan vote." Her voice grew stronger with each word, each statement a brick in the wall of her authority. "I graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School, where I was the first black woman to serve as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Law Review. Before my appointment to the bench, I served for 8 years as a federal prosecutor in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice." Miller's public defender was frantically scribbling notes, likely trying to calculate the astronomical number of years in federal prison his client was now facing. "During my tenure as a federal prosecutor," she continued, her eyes finding Miller's, "I specialized in cases involving police misconduct, civil rights violations, and institutional corruption. I successfully prosecuted 47 cases against law enforcement officers who abused their authority and violated their oath." She paused, letting that number sink into the silent room. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have presided over more than 15,000 cases. I have sentenced hundreds of criminals, from petty thieves to murderers. I have seen every type of criminal behavior, every excuse, every pathetic justification imaginable." Judge Hayes walked closer to where Miller sat cowering, a predator circling its cornered prey. "But in all my years of service, Officer Miller, I have never, not once, encountered such a perfect, such a textbook example of everything that is wrong with policing in America." The packed courtroom was so quiet you could hear the soft scratch of the reporters' pens. "You see, Officer Miller, when you called me a ghetto rat and trash, when you told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, you weren't just assaulting a random citizen." She returned to her position of power behind the bench. "You were assaulting the very person who has dedicated her entire career to ensuring that officers exactly like you are held accountable for their actions." Judge Hayes opened a thick manila file that had been placed on her bench during the recess. "This file contains the detailed records of every case you have testified in over the past 5 years. 43 cases in this courthouse alone, Officer Miller. 43 times you have stood where you are now, placed your hand on a Bible, and sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She flipped through several pages, her expression grim. Of those cases, 28 involved defendants who were people of color. In 26 of those cases, you were the sole arresting officer. And in every single one of those 26 cases, Officer Miller, your testimony described the defendants using remarkably similar language to what you used to describe me this morning. Her voice was a merciless indictment. Acting erratically, refusing to comply, becoming aggressive, threatening officers' safety. The same words, the same narrative, the same lies, over and over and over again. Judge Hayes closed the file with a sharp, final snap. But here's what you didn't know, Officer Miller. For the past 6 months, as part of that joint federal investigation I mentioned, we have been conducting a deep dive analysis of your career. Your name, Officer Miller, appears at the very top of a federal watch list for officers with a pattern of excessive force and racial bias. You have been under surveillance. Your communications have been monitored. Your arrest patterns have been subjected to rigorous statistical analysis. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that every person in the room could hear. And this morning, Officer Miller, in your infinite arrogance, you provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable, videotaped evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could ever hope for. Judge Hayes lifted her gavel. You assaulted a federal judge while she was in the performance of her official duties. You did so based explicitly on racial animus, as evidenced by your own recorded statements. You then committed felony perjury when you lied under oath about the circumstances of that assault, and you suborned perjury by encouraging your fellow officers to do the same. The gavel hovered in the air like a hangman's noose. Officer Miller, you asked me this morning if I knew my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. Her voice filled the courtroom with quiet, unshakable authority. My place is on this bench, in this courtroom, ensuring that justice is served. My place is holding people like you accountable when you betray the trust and abuse the power that we, the people, have entrusted to you. The gavel came down once, the sound echoing like a rifle shot. My place, Officer Miller, is making absolutely certain that what you did to me this morning is the very last act of racial violence you will ever commit as a police officer. Miller finally understood. He hadn't just picked the wrong person to assault. He had picked the one person who could, and would, burn his entire world to the ground. And she had just lit the match. Judge Hayes stood behind her bench, her judicial robes flowing around her like armor forged from justice itself. The packed courtroom held its collective breath as she prepared to deliver what everyone knew would be a historic verdict. Officer Miller, she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of jurisprudence. Before I render judgment in this matter, I want to address not just you, but everyone in this courtroom, and everyone who will hear about what happened here today. She gestured to the gallery, packed with lawyers, court staff, reporters, and citizens who had heard whispers of the extraordinary proceedings. This morning began with a simple question. What happens when someone with a badge and a gun believes they are above the law? What happens when years of unchecked power, departmental protection, and systemic rot create a person who thinks they can assault a federal judge on the steps of her own courthouse and face no consequences? Miller sat slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his life and career crumbling around him in real time. The answer, Officer Miller, she said, her eyes boring into him, is standing before you right now. Judge Hayes picked up her gavel, the same one that had been engraved with the words Solum Veritatem Spectat. Behold the truth alone, on the day she took her oath of office. For 15 years you have terrorized this community. For 15 years you have violated the constitutional rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black or brown. For 15 years you have made a complete mockery of the badge you were sworn to honor. Her voice grew stronger, more passionate, a rising tide of righteous fury. But your greatest mistake, Officer Miller, wasn't any single act of brutality. Your greatest mistake was believing that the system would always protect you, no matter how far you went, no matter how many lives you destroyed. Miller finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and utterly defeated. This morning, when you called me a filthy animal and told me I belonged in a cage, when you slammed me against the wall of my own courthouse, when you handcuffed me and paraded me through these halls like a trophy, you thought you were asserting your dominance over just another powerless victim. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone in the packed courtroom to strain to hear her words. But I was never powerless, Officer Miller, and neither were any of the hundreds of people you've brutalized over the years. The only difference is that today, justice finally had a witness. She straightened to her full height, a towering figure of righteous authority. Officer Miller, based on the irrefutable evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the 1st degree, a felony. The words hit the courtroom like thunder. I find you guilty of assault on a judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Miller's attorney closed his eyes and put his head in his hands. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to 10 years in prison. With each pronouncement, Martinez seemed to shrink further into his chair, becoming smaller and more insignificant. And I find you guilty of perjury in the 1st degree for your false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Judge Hayes paused, letting the crushing weight of those charges settle over the room. But Officer Miller, this case was never really about you. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery, her voice ringing with passion. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid out millions in settlements while allowing the abuse to continue. For too long, we have told the victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count against an officer's, that justice simply isn't for them. Her voice rose to a crescendo. But that ends today. What happened in this courtroom today proves that no one is above the law. Not a police officer, not a prosecutor, not a judge, not a politician, no one. Miller suddenly broke down completely, his body shaking with deep, gut-wrenching sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choked and pathetic. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I never meant—" Judge Hayes looked down at him, not with pity, but with a cold, hard clarity. "Officer Miller, your apology is 15 years and 47 formal complaints too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable." She lifted her gavel high above her head, a final, terrible instrument of judgment. "But here is what I want you to understand in your final moments as a free man. Every single person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice that I am delivering today. Every grandmother you called a slur, every teenager you planted drugs on, every doctor you arrested for the crime of living in the wrong neighborhood, they all deserved to see you held accountable." The gavel hovered in the air. "Today, I am not just delivering justice for myself. I am delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I am delivering justice for every family that had to watch their loved one be brutalized while the system looked the other way. Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom. Officer Miller, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives. The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of doom. Officer Frank Miller, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by law. You will serve 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Miller collapsed completely, his sobs now the uncontrollable wails of a damned soul. Furthermore, Judge Hayes continued, her voice cutting through his cries, I am ordering a full, independent federal investigation into every case you have ever touched, every arrest you have ever made, and every complaint that has ever been filed against you. The victims you have silenced for 15 years will finally have their day in court. She set down her gavel and looked out over the stunned, silent courtroom. Let this be a message to every official who thinks they can abuse their power without consequences. Justice may be blind, but she sees everything, and eventually she comes for everyone. The courtroom erupted, not in applause, but in a collective cathartic exhale. Justice, swift and terrible and righteous, had finally been served. 6 months later, the ripple effects of that historic morning continued to transform the entire justice system of Port Sterling. Officer Frank Miller was serving his 25-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison, where news of his crimes had made him a pariah. His badge, his pension, his freedom, all gone. The man who once terrorized a community now spent his days in protective custody, finally understanding what it felt like to be powerless. But Miller's downfall was just the beginning. The federal investigation Judge Williams ordered uncovered a web of corruption and cover-ups that reached deep into the PSPD's command structure. 12 other officers, including Russo and Davis, were terminated and faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. 4 supervisors were indicted. The entire department was placed under a federal consent decree, forcing systemic reform from the top down. The 432 cases that Miller had tainted were reopened. Dozens of wrongfully convicted men and women were exonerated and released from prison, walking into the arms of weeping families. Hundreds more had their charges dropped or their sentences reduced. The county paid out an additional $8.7 million in compensation to Miller's victims, money that came directly from the police department's budget, forcing a painful but necessary reckoning. Judge Hayes herself became a national symbol of judicial integrity and courage. She was invited to speak at law schools across the country, sharing the story of how one moment of violence revealed decades of systemic abuse. Her message was always the same. Justice delayed is justice denied, but justice delivered can change the world. The Donnelly Federal Courthouse was officially renamed the Judge Evelyn M. Hayes Federal Courthouse in her honor. A bronze plaque near the entrance now commemorates the morning that changed everything, with a simple inscription, "Here, justice finally found its voice." But perhaps the most powerful change was in the community itself. Citizens who had spent years living in fear of the police began coming forward, believing for the first time that their voices would be heard. Community oversight boards were established with real power. Police training programs were completely overhauled, with Judge Hayes personally helping to design new curricula on constitutional rights, de-escalation, and unconscious bias. The video of Judge Hayes delivering her verdict became the most watched piece of courtroom footage in Internet history, viewed over 50 million times. Comments poured in from around the world, from people who had experienced similar injustices, but had never seen accountability delivered so completely, so publicly, so perfectly. Today, Frank Miller sits in his prison cell, probably thinking about the moment he chose to assault a woman because he thought she was powerless. He thought he knew his place in the world, and he thought he knew hers. He was wrong about both, because sometimes justice doesn't just wear a blindfold. Sometimes justice wears judicial robes. Sometimes justice carries a gavel. And sometimes, when the moment is right, justice hits back. What do you think? Was this the most satisfying karma you've ever seen? Let me know in the comments below. Never underestimate the power of standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem. Share this story if you believe that everyone deserves justice, regardless of who they are or what they look like. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories of courage triumphing over corruption, and subscribe, because true stories like this happen every day, and we all deserve to see them brought to light. Your story could be next, because the truth always finds a way.